Hello and welcome back to Got Melanin, the podcast brought to you by the UK chapter of the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, aka also known as WCAPS. What's up, my good sis Mary?
What's up, Mel? I am happy that it is Monday and we have some exciting guests here today.
Hi, everyone.
Miss Neda, it is a pleasure to have you with us today. Oh my gosh, it's like the WCAPSs are colliding.
I love it so much. Thank you for having me.
Before we hop into the show, we're going to let you give the people a brief rundown on who you are so they know what the business is.
Yeah, I'm Neda. I'm an attorney in DC. I'm the WCAPS fellow. I'm a human rights advocate. I come from an Arab American background. I'm definitely pro-Palestine and Black Lives Matter. I did fieldwork in Kenya and Senegal. I worked at the UN, and then I did direct representation of different human rights, of clients facing different human rights issues.
And I this morning made an omelet, so, just little victories here and there. We take what we can get. I was saying earlier, actually, how impressed I am with, because Neda, you're like 2 years older than me, essentially. And like your entire CV at 27 is low-key what I'm hoping to achieve when by the time I'm like 45. And so I'm just shook at like this level of just, yes, like brown girl excellence. Like it's wonderful and it's beautiful. And like just so happy to have you with us.
Thank you. I feel like I haven't done enough yet. I'm just getting started.
This is the energy that we want. This is the energy of why you are here. This is the energy of why we are having this conversation, because we know there is so much more still for us to do. And on that note, on doing more, as we say at the beginning of every single episode, Black lives still matter. If your timeline's going back to normal, they mattered yesterday, today, 10 years from now. We are still looking for justice for Breonna Taylor. The newest news to come out is my good sis was alive for 5 minutes, gasping for air, and the police logs show that no one attended to her for 20 minutes after you broke into her house and killed her. We take this time to acknowledge that moment.
It's been 110 days, I think.
It's 100 plus. We're at 100 plus.
I saw 126 the other day, and that was like 5 days ago. And I obviously, even with these cases, like there's the day that they unfortunately like pass and are taken from us, and then there's the day when it reaches the media. So like even in the case of this young boy he was 16. That's why I'm saying boy, because ain't no man at 16. And he was like a ward of the state of Michigan, and he literally threw a sandwich across the cafeteria, and that was enough to get tackled by like 3 aides, and they sat on him for 10 minutes, and then they waited an additional 10 minutes before calling anyone to like check on him and see if he was okay. And that happened in like April, I believe. But even just now, because, I like to think of, if you don't know who Sean King is yet, like, he's someone to know in this whole topic of BLM, because this man is, like, my parents were asking me the other day, like, oh, who's the leading Martin Luther King-like figure? And I was like, well, ain't no MLK-like figure, but Sean King is pretty close, like, in terms of, like, that.
No, he is not my guy.
But, yeah, he's problematic. He's, like, not, I don't know.
He's like the voice to follow, but I'm saying that like he's definitely been like posting a lot of just like
I'll give you, he does post a lot. You got me on the post a lot
of like the whole like, oh, I need this person's badge number, blah blah blah, like more.
But he also does like plagiarize.
There is no K-like person, by the way. Like at this point I feel like it has become like a lot more of like a collective movement rather than like spearheaded by like one person and like that one figure,
I've heard he plagiarizes all the work by Black women and claims it as his own.
There's also a lot of big things coming out from D. Ray McCusson talking about where is his money actually going. There's a great piece in Medium. I believe, about that. But I agree with you in terms of his ability to mobilize people on social media via posting videos, which sometimes are incendiary, and sometimes are all right. We're always riding a fine line there.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's a fine line between revolutionary and radical. Or is it the same thing? Oh, but yeah, no, even in his case, like, he only kind of just posted about this kid. And so in my head, I'm like, if it's taken even Sean King's team to, like, or maybe he knew from before. But my point is that, like, there is just such a break between, like, when the murders happen and, or, like, what they like to call as incidents, and, you know, when they're actually discussed and talked about on mainstream media. And I guess it's even, you know, in the case of our topic today, those who are undocumented or who are fleeing conflict are absolutely almost never talked about in, like, mainstream media and news.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. You know, as we look to this episode and we start to talk about citizenship and understanding people's place in countries, right? We can go back to every episode that you and I have had where we've talked about, specifically in the U.S. case about black people. We can go back to slaves were 3/5 of a person. We see the legal ramifications of citizenship still today in deciding, are you given the unalienable rights that you're supposed to be given by your naturalized birth into this country? And it makes me think of, Neda, I read your article and you literally said, like, citizenship is the right to have a right. And right now, many black people, by many, I mean all black people in America, are not being given that citizenship. And that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So into what is a citizen? So the citizenship is the right to have rights. Citizenship, when you are a national of a state, you become protected by the laws in place by that state. So having nationality, having citizenship grants you protection by the state. It's the link through which the individual gets the benefit of rights in the domestic and international law.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, like, it's not even that people don't get what citizenship is, but it is just, like, just that fact. Like, it's not even just a question of, like, oh, like, what citizen, or, like, where are you from? It's more of, like, oh, like, I actually belong within, not even a structure, but, like, I'm recognized. Like, for me, what I'm getting a lot from, like, this definition is, like, this recognition of existence, of ability, of, like, power within. Here
in the U.S., you know, we always hear, like, it went very viral against Ilhan Omar when Trump was like, go back to your country. Right? She is a U.S. national. She is a citizen of this state. So her country is here. And so one of the things that people tend to mix up in the media and just in general, like, racist rhetoric, is ethnicity to citizenship. So you can have an ethnic background where you are part of a social group of people, right? You can have an ethnic background where you share a language, you share a culture, you share values, but where you are a citizen is not necessarily where your ethnic background stems. So while I can be, like, a Syrian ethnic person, I am a U.S. citizen, and this is the state that grants me protection, no matter whether I'm in Syria or in the United States.
Yeah. No, and see, and you mentioned Trump. Jesus. I know that there's that pause on Spotify, and I hope everybody knows it was for me to roll my eyes. But it goes back to that moment, if we're going to talk about in the U.S. context of citizenship and blackness and refugee status, I will never forget January 11th, 2018, when Trump was in a meeting with U.S. senators talking about Haiti and El Salvador and African countries, and had the audacity to say, why do we have all of these people from shithole countries coming here?
He reportedly made the comments during a White House meeting with a bipartisan group of senators. The White House tonight is not denying the president made the remarks. Now, we want you to know our report includes that expletive once so that you can hear the complete quote for yourself. And of course, it may not be appropriate for some of our younger viewers. NBC's Peter Alexander has details.
The president tonight apparently uncorking another astonishing statement, complaining to lawmakers in the Oval Office about protections for immigrants. Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here? According to a Democratic aide familiar with the conversation, Mr. Trump was referring to African nations and Haiti. before suggesting the U.S. should have more people from places like Norway, whose prime minister he met yesterday. A White House spokesman tonight not denying the president's words, but saying certain Washington politicians choose to fight for foreign countries. But President Trump will always fight for the American people.
Those are verbatim words that came out of his mouth. And this rhetoric was not new to him. This was weeks after he was talking about Nigerians and he said that they won't go back to their huts, or when he said that Haitians all have AIDS. And the thing about it is, I know there are going to be people listening to this, or people that are new to our show that are watching this that are going to be like, oh, this is a Trump problem. This is an American race problem. Well, let's have that conversation, right? Trump's rhetoric came from somewhere. And if we look historically, it comes from the Know Nothing Party, which was the original party pre-civil rights, which was anti-immigrant. It was all about creating American values, about Protestantism, about temperance, about a positive work ethic. It had a 21-year naturalization process for immigrants to get into the country. That's where this rhetoric came from. But back then, it was anti-immigrant, and it included white people. When we look at today's anti-immigrant rhetoric, especially under the Trump administration, let's be very clear, it's pro-white. Trump has no problem with the naturalization of his in-laws, but he has a lot of problems with the black and brown people coming in from different countries, which is why we see things like the Muslim ban that we saw in, what was that, like 2017, 2016?
After his inauguration, it was his first official act as president to enact the Muslim ban. And it was, there's been 4 versions of it now. We've ramped it up every time. So we're now on Muslim ban 4.0, actually.
Oh, because, everything needs an update. So if you want it to work, you need to update it, apparently.
No, yeah. And so you working in this, Neda, like what, because obviously you have seen all of this go through, apparently these 4 stages of Muslim ban. But what would you say? Because I feel like a lot of our listeners are entering this conversation and all they're getting is clips from the media of understanding this is what a refugee is, this is what an asylum seeker is, this is how the Muslim ban has affected black and brown refugees in America. But as somebody who actually has worked on these issues and worked with these people, what would you start to say to have the conversation with people?
Yeah, so the Muslim ban was actually, so it's been called different things, right? It's been called the travel ban, it's been called the refugee ban, it's been called the Muslim ban. Its original title is Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry. So that's actually the title of the executive order. It's Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry. And there's been 4 versions of it. We're now on Muslim ban 4.0, as I said. Every time it's been ramped up, we've added new countries to it. It's predominantly from Muslim countries, which is why it was called that. He tried to add North Korea in as one of them to say this is, and see, I've added in a non-Muslim country. But the funny part to that is that North Korea was already banned. So it actually didn't, it was more of like a media stint, right? It was like, I've added now this, but it didn't really mean much. There was a Supreme Court ruling about it in 2018 where they upheld 3.0, the ban 3.0, in a 5-4 decision. So it was by the split court, which is also an important reason to vote because we have 2 Supreme Court seats that are going to be up within the next year. It's kind of scary to think that the Supreme Court decides for the next couple generations. I mean, we still abide by court cases held in 1860. Put that into perspective. Your Supreme Court justices have a lot of power and your president alone nominates them. So that is alone a reason to vote. There was recently another court case put into effect, or that was filed in February 10th of this year. And so we'll see how that one goes. It was supposed to be prioritizing refugees, the implementation of that. I don't know how that will be. So going back, I guess, when you talk about like what is a refugee or what is an asylum seeker or what are all of these things or what is statelessness, all these words that get kind of thrown into the discourse of immigration, they all have very specific meanings. A lot of time people use them interchangeably. Sometimes they can be used interchangeably, but they don't mean the same things. They have really specific definitions. So refugee specifically is a person who gains status outside of the United States and enters the United States with permission to enter. So a refugee is someone who has right of entry before they arrive. So they come here as valid people. They are allowed to enter the United States. They are granted the rights and protections of refugee status. They are entitled to be here. And in 5 years, they can apply for citizenship. It does grant them a path. You have then what's called an asylum seeker. Asylum seekers are people who show up to the border and they ask for status there. It takes them a while. Usually that goes, they ask for status, they're taken to detention, it goes through processing, depending on what's found. So refugee and asylum seeker, they actually are almost the exact same thing. The only difference is one gains status outside the state, one asks for status in the state. And then you have what is statelessness. And statelessness, again, it's somebody who has no nationality to any state. It's someone who's not considered a national by any state under any operation of law. So statelessness is specifically the lack of a status, whereas refugee status is a status in itself. Like refugees and asylum seekers have status. That is their legal status. Whereas statelessness, if you are a stateless person, you lack status anywhere. You have zero status. And it's really scary. One of the reasons one of the really big fears behind statelessness is it really allows for exploitation, trafficking, enslavement. That's how you really get put into the black market systems, because on paper you don't exist as a human in any context. You can never own property. You can't get valid travel documents. You'll never get an ID. You can't open a bank account. And in a lot of cases, you can't get status unless you go through some other means. So in the Middle Eastern context, a lot of countries who women cannot pass their status to men, but men can pass their status to women. It encourages, forced marriages younger and younger. It encourages people to kind of commit these sort of violations or perpetuates these violations because they want to gain status. They want their daughters to go to school. They want them to have opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have if they stay stateless. They want future generations to have some kind of status. So you do have situations in which stateless people are not always displaced, right? I can be born and raised in the same place my whole life and be a stateless person there. Whereas refugees and asylum seekers are people who cross borders, right? I can't be an asylum seeker in my own country because I fear prosecution in my country. But I can be a stateless person in the country I was born in. And that is very common, where you have generations that were just born into, unfortunately, this situation. It doesn't make them less human. It doesn't make them less deserving of rights. It doesn't make them less of a person. It doesn't make them a criminal. It's just the circumstance that they were born into because of a flawed system, unfortunately.
Is it so to kind of, I'm not going to say to dumb it down because this is not what we're trying to do here, but I think if we were to kind of make it very straightforward, then would you say that a stateless, or am I right in saying that a stateless person is someone that basically doesn't have any formal form of ID, or are they just not on any registry at all? Because in my, in my head, certain, you do have people that are born in hospitals but don't have any documentation, and vice versa, and so that aren't born in hospitals and that do have it. So yeah, is that kind of fair to say, or is that is there something much deeper that has to do with
No, it's much deeper. It's much deeper. So in the United States, we have birthright citizenship. If you're born in a hospital here, you will be a registered citizen. We actually, in the United States, is one of the best states for combating statelessness because of that reason. We don't have many stateless people in the United States because we have undocumented people who have status elsewhere. But stateless people, generally, we have a smaller population here because of birthright citizenship. But within the stateless context, that's people who have no status anywhere. And so a way that a lot of stateless people can achieve some form of status is to register with UNHCR as a stateless person. And then UNHCR will advocate on their behalf to the last country that they've lived in. So it doesn't always work. It depends on the relationship with that country. But that is kind of the system that's in place. And UNHCR, that's the UN agency that deals with refugees. But again, there's really specific criteria. So if I'm applying for asylum or I'm applying for refugee status, I have to have specifically like a fear, and it has to be a well-founded fear. So it has to be of returning or traveling to a country where I am in, I could get tortured and or killed as a result of I think it's political opinion, political opinion, social opinion, or I'm sorry.
Gender, race, and stuff as well?
It's not gender. It's race, religion, political opinion, social group, and there's one more that I am overlooking, but there are 5 of them. There are 5 criteria, and if you don't fall within that, you don't have a right to asylum or refugee status. So even to achieve those statuses, it's really difficult. So a lot of people now in the United States who are coming here from different nations in Central America who fear gang violence, it's been held by our courts that those don't count within the 5 groups. And so that's why a lot of people, don't fit the definition. They get turned around. It's not because they're not facing these serious situations. It's because they don't fit within the limitations that the law provides, which are actually created by the Refugee Convention.
Okay, this is my question now. Because I went and relooked at this convention, right, today. I've not, like, during my master's and stuff, I did a master's in international law, and, like, literally the first semester was all about, like, reading law that's, like, at that level, and that's supposed to be universally applicable like that. And then especially like in the context of like French asylum seeking / like refugee law, there's basically I don't want to call it a loophole, because again, like it's not that it's supposed to be a way for, you know, our Western governments to like circumvent taking accountability for the messes that they started abroad. But however, you know, there is this they're like the second, like what, number 2 in Europe, I think, when it comes to like asylum seeking requests. And they essentially have established like 4 scenarios in which you can be denied your request. And one of them is basically if they believe that like the person who's seeking asylum is like doesn't need to seek it anymore because and they're referring to like literally Article 1C5 of like the convention, which literally just basically says that like a person is no longer like entitled to seek asylum if like the country of origin that they're running away from, you know, is back at like a normal kind of calm, peaceful place. And this is also just my issue in general with like the idea of international law. Theory, fantastic. Practice means interpretation, and especially in the context when you've got different languages. So like, what does the French government think is a state of peace or like a state of democracy? If they believe that, you know, you're at a place where actually, same as with the US and like gang violence in Central America, you know, you can't, I just hate this idea of being able to like make it malleable. And obviously like, that's part of what law is, and that's why like we have it the way that we do, because it's supposed to be applicable depending on the situations and scenarios. But like you can't tell me that most of they've listed like, sorry, I'm looking at my notes, but they've basically listed like Georgia in Europe, Senegal, Chile, Sierra Leone as places that like you can't really seek asylum from anymore. And I'm like, I don't think that these places are necessarily, like, completely peaceful and fine still. Like, my mom lives in Senegal. I've been there a couple of times since she's been there. Yeah, they were able to, I think it was, like, the mayor of Dakar, which is the capital city, had been embezzling, like, hella funds. And basically they were like, no, you can't do that. So there is this sense of, like, okay, there is, like, this rule of law that is applied and that is followed through. But to say that, like, oh no, everything's fine there, you can't seek asylum no more, like, that's quite jarring. Because again, like, what if you had people now in the, like, God forbid, right? This is not something I'm trying to speak into existence. But, like, in theory, let's say in 6 months, you have the US that's, like, in a really bad shape. And now you've got people that are, like, seeking asylum because as, you know, anti-Trump, or, like, as Democrats, or as liberals, or as even just in general black people, you're being shot down and hunted down in the streets and stuff. Like, is France going to turn around and be like, actually, your country is a really great democracy, and therefore, like, good luck, but we can't take you in? That's really like, it for me, it defies the entire purpose of, like, international law, and the reason why we have these organizations and these structures that exist on, like, a global level to stop further violence from happening and, like, stop the creation of further refugees. Like, this refugee convention was created because of what World War II did to Jewish Europeans. You know, it was created to avoid these scenarios. So, like, how could you then turn around and, like, still use that as a way to be like, oh, well, actually, no, you fall under, like, this one specific clause of a clause of a clause, and therefore, like, we can't do that to you. Like, we can't give you this right.
Right. Yeah, I struggle a lot with the Refugee Convention. I think it has a lot of issues. But when you look at international law, it is problematic in a lot of ways. But also, I guess, so international law is like the minimal threshold, right? This is the minimum that states have to meet. And then states who ratify those conventions have to implement it into their law. And that's how it gets, that's how it has power, right? So the United States signed on to the Refugee Convention, they've ratified it, and now that convention is built into the INA system, which is the immigration system of laws that exist in the United States. So it's not that we specifically follow the Refugee Convention. We follow it, but we follow it within our own ratified context. And that's like a lot of states. But I do have a lot of issues with it. I mean, the Refugee Convention was passed in 1951, which granted the right for Eastern European refugees to be accepted into other states. And then it wasn't actually open to the rest of the world until 1967. So refugees from other places didn't count unless they were European descent. And that's... you know, it kind of feeds into a lot of the other problems within the UN system that people talk about, where they say, well, this is a neocolonial system. There are good reasons that people criticize it as that. And some of them being like this. There were definitely situations in our global history where large numbers of refugees came out of the world, but we just didn't recognize them. You know, we didn't include states who were colonized and imperialized and pillaged and destroyed prior to Europeans becoming those people, becoming refugees. And not to discount what happened, is a terrible situation, but like the other global, you know, the rest of the world didn't accept refugees before that moment. And so when they talk about the UN and the conventions being a sort of neocolonial structure, it's not wrong.
Yeah, no, completely. And even in the context of, like, you know, we were talking about statelessness earlier, and the kind of massive case in the UK currently is the story of Shamima Begum. I hope I'm not pronouncing it incorrectly.
She was just a schoolgirl, just 15, but her decision to leave East London for Syria to join the so-called Islamic State matured this teenager into a national security threat. After 4 years with the terror group, Shamima Begum, by then with a newborn baby, said she wanted to come home.
Shamima, hello.
But it was ITV News that first showed her the Home Office letter stripping her of her British citizenship, so she'd never be allowed back.
Please find enclosed papers that relate to a decision taken by the Home Secretary.
She took legal action, but her lawyers argued she should be allowed to return to the UK to make her case. And today, the Court of Appeal agreed, ruling the only way in which she can have a fair and effective appeal is to be permitted to come into the United Kingdom to pursue her appeal. Fairness and justice must, on the facts of this case, outweigh the national security concerns. The family's spokesperson has welcomed the decision.
We have to remember this was a 15-year-old child who got groomed and taken to Syria by ISIS fighters. Essentially, we need to be ensuring that we give her a fair trial.
Even though the British government was arguing that, like, due to her Bangladeshi heritage, she could be a citizen of Bangladesh, and Bangladesh was like, she's never been here. Like, what? And I mean, I don't know. To me, it makes sense. Like, I don't really, but yeah. But regardless, like, this is quite the story because obviously she was 15. She was a minor. You don't let minors drive, drink, smoke, vote, nothing. But, you know, she's supposed to be, like, responsible and old enough at that point to know, like, not to join like, she was groomed, which happens to girls across the UK, like, every single day, which happens to boys as well across the UK every single day. Like, this isn't an isolated incident or case or whatever. And, you know, it is this, there's been reports basically that, like, when she's appeared in the media and, like, sources that have reported on her, which, like, how legit are these sources? I don't know. But, you know, they just cite them as sources. Like, apparently she is very much like, or was allegedly like the, you know, perfect ISIS bride, like ISIS wife. That, like, she very much upheld, like, their values, you know, like the dress codes, like everything that had to go into that. Apparently she would, like, walk around with, like, a rifle and stuff, which I'm like, oh my gosh. But yeah, so apparently she was this person that was, like, very much invested in the life, and now having, I guess, lost 2 children and expecting her third one when she was found in the refugee camp, it was like, I want to come home. And at that point, she was over 18. So then became the question of, like, well, what do we do? Like, does she actually get to come home or not? And this story has so many layers because at the end of the day, for me anyway, the thing that sticks out the most is, like, what is, like, who is British? Like, what are these characteristics? How do you define, like, this statehood? You know, in France, the idea is that, like, if you abide by just kind of, like, societal values and that you pay your taxes into the French system, like, you're French. Doesn't really matter. To be delved into some other time. But, like, in the US and English and, like, British context, it's very much this question of, like, values. Do you uphold our values? These values that are so dear to us, da-da-da-da. And it's like, I don't know, man. She was born and raised here. She done lived here her entire life. Like, you just gonna remove her citizenship because there's a possibility that she would have committed acts of terror. Whereas, like, I mean, you know, I don't want to be incendiary, but, like, there were how many acts of terror that were committed, like, during the Irish Troubles? And it wasn't Muslim people, like, you know, it could have been people, like, members of the British Army. And it's, I feel like the conversation gets muddled and mixed up because now it's like, oh, well, she's, you know, a visibly Muslim, like, brown girl that went and fought with it, that went and joined a terrorist cell that has been responsible for, like, the last, 5 years of terrorist attacks across Europe, essentially. Like, it rocked France. Like, I will say, like, it was insane to go home after everything had happened. Like, it was weird. So I could understand the sentiment of some people of being like, she's just been with them, like, we can't let her back in, you know? But then what, you just gonna leave her stateless? Like, you're gonna leave her a refugee when she was born in the UK?
You actually told me about this case, and I did a lot of research on it because I got really curious after we had our initial talk about it. And I learned so much about her. Like, so first of all, her husband, who was part of ISIS, he was Dutch. They met in Syria, but he was a Dutch citizen as well. So they were 2 European persons who had traveled there specifically to join this group. And then I learned, like, just about her story. It was so like crazy to read about. Even like what you had already mentioned it when Britain was like, well, she has Bangladeshi heritage and she has right to Bangladeshi citizenship, and Bangladesh was like, why would we want her? Like, Bangladesh was like, what? Like, she's never been here. 1, 2, what makes you think we would grant her that citizenship? after this situation. And then I think I sent it to you earlier. She won the case like 4 days ago that she actually does have a right to British citizenship. And part of it was because as a British national, she should face prosecution in Britain. And Britain should deal with that situation of prosecuting a British national for acts of terror. And then just like lastly, just one point I think is really important to make. The biggest victims of terrorism are what we consider in the West as terrorism, because it's actually not legally defined. And there is no legal definition of what we consider terrorism, are Muslim people and are the Arab people who live in those spaces. Unfortunately, like we have had select isolated attacks throughout Europe and the US, but those people face attacks 10 times a day. Every single day, they have bombs raining on them at any time. And it is a constant parade of attack. So we have these terrible isolated incidents, and they're awful, but there are also the biggest victims, which are the Muslim and Arab people in those places.
Well, I think that all comes from a very capital W West ideology of who is right, who is allowed to do things which we might see problematic, what is an issue and what isn't. And I know, Neda, you talk about, you know about this, but in the U.S. context, let's be real, we redefined the idea of terror after 9/11. And there had been domestic terror in the United States since its inception. There's a reason that in 2020, even groups like the KKK are not considered domestic terrorist groups, but we love to have conversations about things not happening on U.S. soil and calling Black and brown people terrorists and redefining an entire group of people by one occurrence, and then also not taking any responsibility for how you got into that situation. Nobody wants to talk about backstories and works in which you did in these countries. And as Neda just said, the effects on people living in these zones. But we like to criminalize people, call them illegal, call them terrorists, redefine their citizenship and their place in the capital W West, without thinking of our own place and its own role in how we got here. And that in itself is incredibly problematic. And I think, Neda, you can probably talk more to this than I can, but I always go back to the U.S. not holding itself accountable. And let's be real, ICE, which is the big thing that we talk about now, and the raids and the deportations and detentions of quote unquote illegal people, but no person is illegal. Run that back if you didn't hear me. No person is illegal. But ICE was not created until 2002 in the wake of 9/11. That in itself tells you who we suddenly decided was illegal.
Yeah, it's really, and just as like step back a second too, just on the ISIS note, Tony Blair in 2015 actually apologized for the creation of ISIS and blamed Britain and the US in a public statement.
For that decision today, I accept full responsibility. Without exception and without excuse. I recognize the division felt by many in our country over the war. And in particular, I feel deeply and sincerely, in a way that no words can properly convey, the grief and suffering of those who lost ones they loved in Iraq, whether members of our armed forces, the armed forces of other nations, or Iraqis. The intelligence assessments made at the time of going to war turned out to be wrong. The aftermath turned out to be more hostile, protracted, and bloody than ever we imagined. The coalition planned for one set of ground facts and encountered another. And a nation whose people we wanted to set free and secure from the evil of Saddam became instead victim to sectarian terrorism. For all of this, I express more sorrow, regret, and apology than you may ever know or can believe.
Where he said the invasion in Iraq actually left that vacuum open that created ISIS and actually took credit for it. And that was a big move on the part of Britain, because the US never made that acknowledgement.
What?
I just learned that. I mean, I knew that the role of the US and the UK in the creation of ISIS solely because of my own work, but I did not know he made that statement, and that is
Either.
huge.
He made an apology about it because he said, so I guess the history of that organization, which is really sad, after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, a lot of Iraqi people had helped the U.S. and Western powers, rise up against Saddam. And then after he fell, instead of rallying with those people to create a partnership, they fired all of them. And so immediately these people were all armed and suddenly out of work and had no anything, and a lot of resentment in a destroyed country, really. And so that is what created the vacuum that then later led to these different terrorist organizations. And he fully acknowledged it, actually. And it was in a documentary, too, that Fareed Zakaria made on CNN, where you can find, I think it's called The Road to Hell or something like that. But it's 45 minutes. It's really interesting. And it's about these systems, and it's about how these different facets that were happening in the West led to those creations in the East.
Yeah. I did not, sorry, just because with my organization, Deducation, we focus on, the arms trade. And, yeah, there you go. Perfect example of, how you actually don't get to control where your arms and weapons end up. Because one day you're arming people who you think are who you're, telling are your allies and who are going to be, instrumental in their visions happening and in their making them believe that we're definitely here to help your cause, arming them to the teeth, and then bouncing without anything else. What'd you expect, that they just gonna hand over everything oh, sorry, you forgot this, by the way? No, that doesn't work like that. And then now it's shock, horror, oh my god, there's this. Yeah, you created it. Literally, you created it. Same situation with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
The first people to arm Bin Laden were the U.S.
Sorry?
The first people to arm Bin Laden was the U.S. The U.S. partnered with him in the 70s, leading up to, or in the 80s, something, leading up to later attacks, it's really sad because, none of these situations are good. No people hope for violence, and they hurt everyone.
No. Yeah. No, completely. That it just kind of, sorry, I just wanted to, my arms trade ears started ringing, and I was I need to just, discuss this right now, because this is what makes me, so mad, is specifically these things. You waste how much money, how much energy, you pollute how much in order to, create these literal weapons of death, and then you turn around and you say, no, this is good for the economy, oh my gosh, American exceptionalism, British innovation, whatever, when in reality, no, you're literally just arming the future people that you're going to be demonizing and vilifying, creating more reasons for you to create more arms. It just infuriates me. Not okay.
No, it's really sad. I mean, it's really sad. And you see, especially in the U.S. arms situation, I mean, I remember just being a Syrian person, right? I have all the Syrian people during the height of war were passing news on social media, right? On Facebook, on Twitter. That's how news gets passed around in today's world. And you would see videos, propaganda videos posted by these armed groups receiving arms dropped down by U.S. planes who were landing accidentally in the wrong spots, but then gave them access. And so if you actually pay attention to some of the violent videos you see, most of the weapons are U.S. grade. Mm-hmm. And it's because they were either accidentally provided, or they were taken, or they were in some underground situation. But it's really alarming. It's really sad. And then you don't give credit to it here, and they're just oh, these people are violent. But what's allowed for that violence really stems from something beyond that, from a bigger situation, from a system that's problematic.
And that's it, right? We and I feel like we always get back to this, and I feel like that has been the whole crux of the first 3 episodes, and even thinking in here about how we're continuing to define what a citizen looks like, what it's like statelessness, what the effects of the capital W West as a system have had on the world, and the way that that has played a role in how Black and brown people are treated, not only in those countries in the West, but the effects back in the respective countries which are being demonized. And it's interesting, and I know that you can probably talk about this to the gills, but the ways in which we police Black and brown people in these specific places as a result of these labels that we've put on people based on their status, right? So I always go harken back to the U.S. context, and I think the main reason I wanted to have this conversation in the juxtaposition against BLM is the role in which and you and I have talked about this multiple times, like the role in which privatized prisons have played in creating the current detention centers in the U.S. You know, we've talked a lot about in previous episodes, there would be no policing, there would be no prison system if it didn't start with the 13th Amendment loophole that allowed for people to be slaves under the state, right? Then we know when the South was going into recession, they were like, contract prison labor, there's the answer. So our prisoners got Blacker and younger. Then we talked about last week, or whenever the heck that episode was, we talked about the war on drugs. And we specifically talked about the effects on Black people. But the point that we didn't even get to mention, which is important here, is the role in which mandatory minimum sentences played out on non-citizens and the new ways in which mandatory minimum sentences equaled deportation for non-citizens of the U.S. So today in 2020, as privatized prisons are stapled, very, very deeply entrenched into the U.S. political system, we're now using them as detention centers. In Obama's 2016 administration, the DOJ stopped using privatized prisons because they said they were inhumane, they said that they were less safe, they said that they were more punitive. But as you already mentioned, the minute Trump got in office, Jeff Sessions said, psych, we are using privatized prisons. And at the same time, ICE and the Department of Homeland Security said, these are our new detention centers. And I know you know that that's a multi-billion-dollar industry, but what kind of effects do you feel like you've seen in the correlation of how that's necessarily played out for immigrants or refugees or asylum seekers, all the people, stateless people, all of the people that we've seen enter the U.S. context as Black and brown people in this system?
So let's step back to the creation of ICE, which you touched on earlier, which was created after 9/11, right? And it was created in the wake of that, specifically as an enforcement agency within DHS. When that happened, that was the biggest government restructuring since World War II. I mean, the U.S. put a lot of effort into restructuring DHS, and that was because of 9/11, right? So we started to view immigration at that specific moment through this national security lens, rather than it being a human migration lens or a human rights lens or some other facet. You know, no person wants to leave their home. No person wants to take their belongings or the last of their belongings and go somewhere else. But we started viewing it through this national security lens. And so we started adding military funds to it as well, right? So the militarization of immigration, which also the militarization of police, these things started happening in unison. We started to enforce in a more militarized manner. We started to tighten border security. We started to collect more data. We started to do bio data and do like face recognition. And we started to detain people in less humane ways, which you've already mentioned, right? Rather than having, so I actually just recently did a report on Venezuela and Colombia and the different, because of course there's a refugee crisis happening in Venezuela and a lot of people are going up to Colombia. And it was really interesting to read about how they have welcome centers and receptionist centers where when Venezuelan migrants come, they go through the reception center, they're given a hot meal. Of course, it's not like a 5-star hotel, but it's not a jail. A detention center is a jail. And so when I was in law school, I did my spring breaks at Port Isabel Detention Center, which is in Los Fresnos, Texas. It's one of the largest detention centers. And you walked in every day. They took your phone and your electronics. You went through full security, and you were toured and guided specifically to the rooms you were allowed to see. You are not allowed to go where the actual people are being held. They have specific rooms where the lawyers and legal aid people have to be, and you're not allowed to see beyond that. And then the court is inside of the detention center, and these people will be brought into court like chained. And they're not criminals. They've committed no crime. I want to actually point this out. Immigration is a civil matter. There is no crime of immigration. It is under civil court. We criminalize it, but it's not criminal. It is not a crime to immigrate or to seek asylum. In fact, it's your legal right to seek asylum, and it's the state's legal obligation to actually verify whether you are deserving of asylum. So there is no criminality in this in it at all, right? So when we started criminalizing it, seeing it through a national security lens, now we're in this skewed crimmigration, which is what we call it, right? The crimmigration intersection. That's where we live. And so when you specifically relate it back now to, I think we talked about this before, was like Black and brown persons immigrating, you have, think of the U.S. context in which Black people make up 13% of the U.S. population. Black people make up 8% of immigrants. But 1 in 5 Black people are deported after committing a crime because of the high numbers that Black people are targeted for arrests, for police brutality, for all these other things. So they feed into one another. When you commit a crime in the United States, you serve your sentence, and then you move into deportation proceedings. And deportation and removal, those mean the same things. Removal is the legal term for it. The lay term, or like the everyday term, is deportation. But removal is that. You're being removed from the state. Because Black people face police brutality, face high numbers of arrests, face all this police abuse, are already criminalized in one context, that bleeds into the other context where they're also being deported at higher levels because they have to serve their sentences, and then they get moved into criminal situations. You have the same thing with, of course, like Muslim and Arab people now too, especially after 9/11. The U.S. put in, like FBI agents who are surveying different mosques. There was high numbers of government surveillance and wiretappings and phones. We've all heard about this, right? Like we've all know that this happens, and we've somehow normalized it, which is super problematic. But the thing to remember is that there is no crime being committed. People are being criminalized by rhetoric that is being perpetuated by a flawed system. But there is no crime.
Yeah. No, I feel like I read somewhere when I was doing the research to read up on this, on that point, it was something like 4 in 5 people who were being detained had never committed any criminal act. And if they had, it was something as minor as like a traffic ticket.
Yeah. That's what you'll get, like a stop sign, something stupid, and suddenly you're in deportation proceedings. But you've lived here and you've worked here, and by the way, like undocumented people, especially undocumented people who do really difficult jobs, put money into our tax system that they will never get back. So they actually benefit the United States economy in a dozen different ways. And they don't get anything out of it because by being undocumented, they're not entitled to any services, and they cannot ask for services because then they'll reveal that they're undocumented.
Like, it kills me, the juxtaposition. Ooh, big word, I know. But, like, the juxtaposition between, like, someone who is, I'm not even gonna, I don't want to talk colors, but gonna have to. Someone that's, like, white and that is on benefits and that's yelling at someone who is like undocumented and is brown and is working, and then being told like, oh, you're just here to take advantage of the system, Nah, actually, you can thank that person for your welfare checks. Like, by the way, like it basic, like that's how, you know what I mean? You can't be, I don't know, I hate the entire idea of like, they're just here to steal our jobs and rip off our economy, la 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 la. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, what are you doing? Like, do you know what I mean? It doesn't, I don't know. Yeah, it infuriates me. But I have a question. I did not know that you could have courts in detention centers.
Yeah. It's so that
how it work if it's not like a judiciary part, like, because it's not a crime, right? So is it like just like an immigration court?
It's called an administrative court. So the judges in the courts are not like the same judges who sit in a regular court. And you're also like, there are different rights that you have and don't have. So when you go to immigration court, you go to administrative court, and you're not granted the right to an attorney. You're also not granted the right to a translator unless you ask for one. So if I am somebody who is traveling across the border, I've just escaped a life-fearing situation, I don't speak any English, and I show up, at the border asking for asylum. They put me in detention. I don't know how to communicate that I need a translator, and they don't provide one to me unless I ask for one. And they're just like, sign these documents, do this, do that. A lot of times people go through the system getting sent back because they just don't know any better. They sign their name on something that the agent hands to them and they think they should sign. They're not granted an attorney to help them. They have no right to an attorney unless they can afford one, or unless somebody like me who provides pro bono counsel can find them in the system. But then that's also another difficulty because there are different barriers within some of the detention centers that stop you from providing adequate representation. And I told you the story I was in when I had an Iraqi client who was not a lucid person. He was in detention in a center in Michigan. The center required me to contact him only through their video conferencing software. The software had been down for 2 weeks. I contacted the center to let them know that I couldn't get to the software and I needed to communicate with the client because he could be deported at any second. And he had a valid life-fearing situation in which if he had been returned to his state of origin, he would be killed. And on top of that, he's not a lucid person to even know what he's facing. We didn't know that he was completely not lucid until actually making contact with the client. But the first time that I tried to communicate with him was a couple weeks after setting up this initial system. I didn't even know if he was still in the state because they wouldn't give me any information from the detention center. The center refused to give him our contact to contact us. They said, no, you have to use this. So, okay, we went through. And by the way, on top of it, you pay for every single minute that you use. So there's also a wealth situation there that stops you. Because I was working for an organization that could afford the minutes, that was a benefit. But if I'm just somebody trying to do something and I can't afford it, it's different. It's another barrier, right? It's another barrier set up through the system. So going through this video screening system, paying for the time with the client, and then getting to the meeting and finding he's not there, later asking why isn't the client there, you're the people who escort him to and from. He's in a jail cell, right? Like he goes where they tell him to. Right. And they were like, oh, we had to put him in punishment. Punishment for what? He's first of all not in jail. He's in detention. He committed no crime. And you put a not lucid person in a solitary punishment. That's really inhumane. And so finally, after being able to make contact with the client, which was 2 weeks out, it had been almost a month that we were trying to communicate with this client. It was heart-wrenching. He had been in Iraq. He had been attacked by gases in the 90s, back with the Saddam invasion. It was a whole story of violence. It was super heart-wrenching. And after finally being able to make contact with him, we won the case on the argument that if you deport him, he cannot get the mental health services he needs to survive in Iraq. That was the argument that won the case, was that there is no mental health structure in place that will allow him to survive. But all of the barriers leading up to that point, and within that time frame, they could have deported him at any second. Technically, he had no case processed, and we couldn't file anything because we never talked to him. So it was all these things happening. And it just happened that we caught him just in time.
And would you say, because I'm hearing that, right? And would you say that's a common reality for people that are coming into this, that are in the country, that are predominantly Black and brown, mainly because, and oftentimes they're not speaking the language in which they are in the country from? Would you say that we already know that we are losing people in the system, because how many children have we lost that have been in cages since Trump has been in office? But would you say, even for a longer period than this heightened 50,000 plus that we've seen in 2019, 2020, that this was a system that was inherently flawed for how we were treating immigrants?
Yeah, I mean, so DHS was created in 2002, right? It was created by Bush, right. 2002. It included 22 federal agencies. This system happened to be one of them that was just kind of put under this umbrella of what we consider DHS today. And DHS, they do have like an important function in today's world, but this system that they've created for the immigration context is super problematic. I mean, it's a lot. We actually don't know how many people are currently in detention. We don't know like the different, who is in what situation. And it's, unless, you know, you have a family or a contact or somebody who's able to contact an attorney for you, you're going through it alone. Like, most of the time. There are people who, of course, they come, they have money, they already have it set up, they know the system, they've communicated with different people, they have somewhat privilege. But that is like a far and few between that have those privileges.
No. Yeah. That makes total sense. And I know, like, and I feel like this is the last point that I want to touch to, because it's been on my heavy heart as people are still protesting in the streets, whether you see that on your timeline or not. People are still out here. And it is this new, and not new necessarily, but it is this reinvigorated movement for people to work together when we talk about things like defund the police and abolish ICE. And I want us to kind of have this moment here as we circle back for people now that they understand things like, what is a citizen? What is a refugee? What is a stateless person? And the roles in which they're playing, not just in the US, but in the global context. But as people are calling for systemic change, it's important that we understand why the movement needs to be intertwined between defunding the police and reallocating systems to save Black and brown lives, and abolishing ICE to, again, save Black and brown lives. And I will give you the last comment on this because I know you know.
No, I wrote down in my notes, and you probably read it, where I put defund the police and abolish ICE are two cries to the same battle. Both of these are law enforcement practices. They're militarized practices. They target Black and brown people. They disproportionately impact brown and Black families. And they're both becoming heightenedly militarized. They both disproportionately affect huge facets of our communities. And we should be super aware. I mean, there was ICE on the streets of Minneapolis and around the United States in the protests because they wanted people to get arrested for protesting so that they could then go and deport them after. I mean, they work in conjunction, and they're two sides of the same coin.
Yep. And I think that's the exact point.
I'm not even gonna lie, like, I go to protests and stuff, you know, completely, but like I am always just like terrified of being on the street, because I know I have like a settlement status here, but like obviously if they think I'm a threat to the greater safety, is quick, out, you're gone, back to France, even though like, yeah, I've never really like fully lived in France, but here we are. But yeah, and that's, even I have this fear, and like I'm French, I can't imagine and it's not even that I put myself in these situations, but like I go to protest, you know what I'm saying? Like I can't even imagine like what it's like for someone that is what it's like for someone that, for which it's like not that easy, and for which it's not that straightforward and like streamlined, which is insane. But I think in this case, you know, like this is the moment when we actually evaluate how these things work, and if we're doing the right things, and if the systems that we have in place are doing what they're supposed to be doing. If they were set up to exclude Black and brown people, they're working perfectly.
They're working immeasurably.
Perfectly. If they were set up to genuinely like protect the country, and then, you know, that more like moral line of like, this is, you know, so that we can kind of like make sure that there's never any threats coming in and stuff, there needs to be a revisit. And like, it's like, just needs to happen, because clearly this is not working at all.
Yep. And that's the conversation. And that's the conversation that we've had today, is that these are points. As usual, we are all friends. Neda is our resident expert on all things, you know, refugee, et cetera, but these are all perspectives. They are ways in which we know as Black and brown women, we are being affected, and we are seeing people that look like us be affected across the capital W West. We leave you with these thoughts to say, how can we change these systems? How can we rethink the ways that people can be protected? Because no person is illegal. Everyone deserves basic human rights, and we should all simply be able to exist and feel safe. So, for all of our U.S. listeners, like we said last time, vote, and not for Kanye, vote. Do your census. Do your census. And be a conscious member of society. Do not come to this table and listen to us speak and then not go back into your community and continue these conversations and continue to push for change. This is a movement, not a moment. I want to take this moment to thank Neda for coming to the table and bringing
Thank you for having me.
We really appreciate you.
Come back when you want.
Come back anytime you want. And as always, you know, thank you everyone for coming to Got Melanin.
Thank you so much. We will see you in 2 weeks. Bye.
Everybody gather round and listen to my song.